Hello, everyone. I was waiting for Sebastian to start. um, my name is Nicolás Terradas. I'm professor here in the Department of Social Sciences. Uh, Not all of you probably know me. We're here to hear, to listen, to pay attention, and to talk, to interact with Dr. Amitav Acharya. I'm going to read for you a little bit of his bio. He probably heard this all around the world many, many times. So I'm trying to do a very just summary of all his achievements and all his contributions. So he's currently distinguished professor at the School of International Service, American University in Washington, D.C., and also UNESCO chair in transnational challenges and governance there. Previously, he was a professor at various other universities in Singapore, National University of Singapore, York University in Toronto, 1993 in Canada. Then in 2007, in University of Bristol in UK. From 2001 to 2007, he served as deputy director and head of research at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, which in 2007 became the famous Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He's currently also honorary professor at Rhodes University in South Africa, guest professor at Nankai University in China. He was the inaugural Boeing Company Chair of International Relations at the Shortman Scholar Program at Tsinghua University in China. And in 2001, he was at Harvard as a fellow in the Asia Center and also in the JFK School of Government, and at Oxford in Christensen Fellow at Oxford. Professor Acharya was born in India, but as you can see, he has traveled all around the world, interacted with audiences from all around the world. He completed his bachelor's and postgraduate studies, particularly his PhD in Australia, in Murdoch University in '87, and he has traveled the globe after that. He's the first non-Western scholar to be elected in 2014-2015 period as the president of the ISA, the International Studies Association, the preeminent association for internationalists. And he received many times from ISA the Distinguished Scholar Awards. In 2015, first time, for contributions to non-Western IR theory and inclusion, something very important that will come out in today's lecture. In 2018, again, for his influence, intellectual works, and mentorship in the field of international organization. And in 2023, recently in Montreal, for his extraordinary impact in globalizing the discipline of international relations, and as well, once again, for mentoring emerging scholars. He has written numerous books and articles. I will not bore you with an extensive list, but some of the most important works that are going to be talked about and referenced today include Reimagining International Relations, published last year in Cambridge University Press with Barry Busan. Also with Barry, he co-authored The Making of Global International Relations in 2019. The Constructing Global Order, Agency and Change in World Politics, a year before. And also prominent books like The End of American World Order, with a second edition in 2018. And Why Govern? Rethinking Demand and Progress in Global Governance. He was the editor of that volume. All these are extremely, extremely well-known books in the field of international relations, and they're path-breaking, and they are research agenda setting for many, many scholars around the world, particularly from the non-core, non-West. His major contributions have been to the diffusion of ideas and norms in world politics, He works particularly from a broadly defined constructivist position in IR, and more generally, he has never abandoned his focus on comparative regionalism and his expertise, his main focus on ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But also, in the core of today's talk, he has contributed to IR in terms, and theory and practice, in terms of the global IR perspective, agenda that we will talk about today. Very briefly, this agenda revolves around 5 or 6 major points that include a call, an invitation, and a challenge to base research in realistic universalism, ground that research in world history, supplement and subsume rather than supplant traditional IR approaches, includes the study of regions, of course, as a core part of international relations, something that was dropped in a way after the end of the Cold War. And very importantly, he eschews exceptionalism. It recognizes, his work recognizes both ideational and material forms of agency. And as we were chatting right before we entered the room, he also is famous for this, this concept of multiplex world order that captures his understanding of the changing conditions of today's international system, not entirely, not solely focusing on a so-called decline of the United States, but more focused on contrary to Eikenberry and other American scholars, on the ongoing changes and the future directions and landscape of international relations, both lowercase IR and capitalized IR. So without further ado, I pass on to you, Amitav.
Thank you very much. I will speak from the podium so that I can see the PowerPoints a bit better. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and thank you, the department and the university, PUCP, for inviting me my very first time in Peru, and of course, first time in Lima and at the university. So I'm at the end of a 7-day visit to the country, and most of it was in the mountains and trekking and seeing cultural sites. So I am a little exhausted, but I'll try my best to go back to the world of academia where I belong. But I have never been one of my mottos in life, if you look at my Twitter site, is always a traveler, never a tourist. The difference between a traveler and a tourist is the traveler always learns and doesn't go to a place because it's nice and interesting. A traveler is somebody, in the tradition of many classical travelers, from Marco Polo to many others, Ibn Khaldun. They travel and they learn and they develop their own ideas, but also revise their own thinking. So my visit to Peru was mainly to learn, not to just see the sights. So even in the heights of Machu Picchu, or feeling very altitude sick in Cusco, or coming to Lima and quite astounded by the city, which seems to be always have a cloud hanging over it. But also absolutely pleasant climate. So you just you learn so much, and also thinking my ideas about global IR in the light of the experience of the pre-Columbian civilizations, including the Inca, but not limited to the Inca in Peru. So with that context, let me go to global IR now. You can see in the first slide that some of the books that have come out. Some of them are co-authored by me and Barry Buzan, co-edited as well. But also we have books on Africa in global IR, Latin America, but it should include Caribbean in global IR. And of course, more recently, a special issue on Southeast Asia in global IR, which is also going to become a book. And there are also many other global IR books, but I thought these will be kind of representative samples of the work on global IR that's growing around the world. I'll show you how global IR has taken off since 2014 by showing you a Google Trends, which actually captures the term global IR rising into prominence in the as a concept. In fact, somebody did a survey recently of the leading IR journals around the world, and bibliometric study found that global IR is one of the hot topics in contemporary IR debate. So with that, let's go to the next. So this is how the genesis of global IR. In 2014, when I was becoming the president of International Studies Association, some of you may know about ISA. This is the largest and most well-respected professional association of academics studying international studies. And it has about 8,000 members and growing. And every year they have an annual convention and they elect a new president beforehand. And I had become president just the previous year, but taking over the presidency at this convention in 2014 in Toronto. And every president has to decide or select a theme. What will be the presidential theme? And that will become the subject of the next convention that president and the team organizes. And this is the theme I chose: Global International Relations and Regional Wars, a new agenda for international studies. And you can find the presidential speech has been published in International Studies Quarterly, but you can find a very also different versions of it. Actual presidential speech, without all the footnotes and all, is actually in Sciences Po in Paris, their website. But this is how it started. The image, basically a colonial image from India, where the British colonial powers were ruling India. They set up a college to educate basically their own people. The British East India Company, which was actually become the imperial power in India, wanted to train British and European civil servants, people coming to work for the company in Indian history, culture, or regional Asian history and culture, so that they can become more efficient civil servants and rule the empire. And they set up a college called Fort William College, named after the fort where British Empire was ruled from Calcutta. British Empire in Asia was ruled from Calcutta. They set up this college in 1800, so 1800 AD. And they appointed faculty, and of course most of the faculty were Indian, because Indians know more about India, or South Asians, now we'll call it. All the students were European, but there were some European professors, British and French, who also taught in the college. So the interesting thing is, when the syllabus was decided, of course the British decided the syllabus, but the knowledge came from the Indians. And what can be taught and not can be taught were decided by the British, even if they had the least knowledge of India. And same thing in the salary structure. The British and European professors in the college got 3 times or 4 times more money than the Indian professors, Indian teachers. So here is a classic illustration, is a painting going back to that period, where you have a British Sahib. It's like a British civil servant student learning from an Indian. He's a Parsi, kind of originally from Persia, but Indian. They work and live in India, Muslim, and teaching the British civil servant about Urdu, for example. So the teacher, the native teacher, so to speak, has more knowledge but gets paid less. And what he can teach, most of them are men, is actually decided by the British. And he doesn't have any autonomy what he can teach or what he can put on the table for learning. And this is about India. This is about a region where the British know little about, but they still control the production of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge. So I thought this will be a good metaphor for the state of international relations today. The whole world, the world is much bigger than the West, or Britain or United States. So IR as a field might have been born in Britain, but it's actually matured in the United States. It's not the whole world, but it is the Western professors and Western academia that decides what should be taught. And also, they had privilege, not just in salary. That's a narrow way of talking about privilege. Privilege meaning who becomes professors and chairs in universities that may have some non-Western professors, but you can see that people teaching about India in Harvard doesn't have to be an Indian. They actually often always go for somebody, or China, go for somebody who is American or British and has spent some time in China. They're good. I'm not saying they're not good. But rarely you will find somebody who is from that country or region getting a chair. And you look at the faculty at Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, you will find most of them are still teaching about international relations. They're mostly very white and from the West. And the international relations remains in some ways in that way. Even though the subject of international relations is becoming global. International relations is becoming a global field. So you have a relatively new program in international relations here, undergraduate level. It's very common now to find them in Indonesia, Turkey, China, India. IR departments are proliferating around the world. In fact, there was a study done by an American Association for University Professors who said business and international relations are the two booming subjects in the future, in the social sciences, outside of science. So the world is becoming bigger, international relations is becoming very popular, but the teaching and the textbooks and the power structure is still in the hands of a very narrow elite in the West. So that is why the idea of global international relations was, to me, seemed more appropriate. And I also brought in regional worlds, because regional worlds mean international relations or global doesn't mean ignoring the local. So global, you cannot really study global in a seamless way, like it's one big canvas. You have to also acknowledge diversity and difference, and regions represent that diversity and difference. So regionalism, comparative regionalism, regional ordering, are also very important. So regions is a subtext, kind of a keyword here for local. So global and local go together, mutually constitute each other. And that is the new agenda for international studies. That should replace the old agenda, which is very Eurocentric and Americanocentric. So let's move to the next one. So I start by saying, what is global IR? I use the term inclusive. Now, I want to emphasize that inclusive doesn't mean, it has a nice feel to it. We are all inclusive, okay? We are nice, we don't discriminate. That's true. There's a normative, moral aspect to inclusive. But inclusive is also very much about broadening horizons of knowledge. Inclusive is being analytically richer and conceptually richer, empirically richer. And so what Global IR does is being inclusive in the sense that it redefines and broadens the discipline of international relations by recognizing the histories, ideas, practices, and contributions of societies and actors that have been neglected or marginalized in the existing IR literature. And that is not just Global South. If you look at my presidential speech, you'll find an article based on that. Also talk about native people. In fact, like American Indians, for example, in the United States, which are, and you can find examples here, although there is a much more of a visible presence of the pre-Columbian people in this area. In the United States, you never see that. In my university, there's one student, just one student who is Native Indian origin. So we have to acknowledge that there are people living in the West who are also marginalized because they have been, it's not just people living in Global South. Similarly, you can say that there are migrant communities who also study international relations, and they have come into your country as refugees, and they get discriminated because they are refugees and they don't speak good English, but they have they are from societies that have, thousands of years of history. So we also want to cater to that. It's not just about global south, people living in global south. It's also people living in the global north who are dominated by, international relations is a very white racist. That's another subject you can find in my book. And we want to also bring in so-called the darker colors and make it inclusive. But at the same time, and going to the next slide, it adds more intellectual firepower. As I said, I like to be inclusive because it is morally right, but it's also functionally very important. It gives you more firepower, intellectual firepower. It makes the discipline able to explain more and more reality of the world. The world is not just the West. The world is a bigger place than the West, and therefore far more people live in the non-West than in the West. And sometimes in areas in between. And so you have to understand the relations, let's say international relations, I'm keeping that old word, because it is a point of reference for us for debate. So if you want to understand their behavior, whether states or non-state actors or institutions like regional institutions, so you need to have a more complete historical understanding of the whole world at its entirety. And otherwise, you will develop theories that really don't explain things, that will help you to understand things. So a lot of international relations theory comes from Europe. It's very Eurocentric, and sometimes developed further in the United States, but the United States never really went beyond the Eurocentric model of IR. In fact, the founding so-called fathers of IR literature are Europeans. Hans Morgenthau was European, and he wrote the most influential textbook on IR. And while some of them are really very good, and I don't want to demean anybody's work, but they really didn't have the same feeling, even in the United States, which is supposed to be at that time, after World War II, the rising superpower and melting pot, all this rhetoric you hear about the United States. But it was really reproducing this very Eurocentric knowledge, adding some specific color, Americanocentric concepts to it, like the theory of hegemonic stability or theory of neorealism. So Americans added a few things, or institutionalism, but they never really went beyond the Eurocentric models. American IR, people say, Stanley Huffman, an IR professor who passed away, who was teaching at Harvard, Huffman said IR is an American social science. That's only true if you look at the institutional development, who had the best departments, who has most money. American IR departments are wealthier than European IR departments. So institutionally, IR is an American social science, but intellectually, foundationally, still a very European social science. Or you can say Euro-American social science in that sense, or Western social science. So if you only use those concepts like balance of power, or multilateralism coming from concept of Europe, or free trade, I'm giving you some ideas from a European model, then you have very limited explanatory power when you apply that to the whole world, not to mention non-European parts of the world. So I'll give you two examples here. This idea of a liberal hegemonic order or liberal international order and hegemonic stability theory, which is pretty much similar to each other. It's a very self-congratulatory theory which argues that the international peace and stability, and I'm generalizing a very complex theory, international peace and stability and prosperity depends on a hegemonic power. You cannot have peace and prosperity in the world without a hegemonic power. And which is that hegemonic power? First Britain, then the United States. They don't even go back to the Roman Empire. Most of this theory is also very presentist, what happened in the last 2 years, 200 years or less. So they won't talk about Chinese hegemony being benevolent, or Indian hegemony in its own region being benevolent, and China at one point was actually close to being a hegemon, at least in East Asia. So it is basically a subtext saying British and American hegemony has been good for peace and prosperity and stability of the world. And if that declines, now, as we can see, it's going to bring in chaos. So that's basically one way of Eurocentrism, Americanocentrism. Doesn't take into account the fact that there are many parts of the world, both in history and even in the contemporary period, which enjoyed peace and prosperity without having a hegemon, certainly not having the United States and Britain as imperial powers there. And you can find that India and China used to be the largest economies in the world. China being number one, India number two in the 18th century, until 18th century. 40%, near 40% of the world's GDP came from these two countries. And they were pretty stable. Of course, empires rise and fall. But India enjoyed a lot of prosperity under different empires, so did China. And then we had chaos. But that happens everywhere. World orders come and go. But only the Americans and the British can provide stability under this idea of hegemony, not others. And on the other hand, we see that was American hegemony really good for the rest of the world? The British hegemony never was very good because it was an imperial hegemony. And the American hegemony was maybe less imperial in the formal sense of colonization. The United States did have colonies, but less so than Britain. But even under a post-colonial American world order, it was not very good for the developing world. Many countries had a lot of wars in Africa, Asia, and to also some extent here, inequality, poverty, famine, and genocide. And the American world order did not really prevent any of this. In fact, may have aggravated it. To maintain stability in Europe and between the US and the Soviet Union, the United States fought a lot of proxy wars, the way it is fighting now in Ukraine, and with Russia. And that created instability. 95% of the wars in the Cold War happened in the global South. So from a global South perspective, the liberal order was not very benign, not very stable. But still the theory says the American world order maintained stability and prosperity. Then same about regionalism. Now, I think we still have a second quick example, which is also familiar to many students who study regionalism, whether it is regionalism here or Africa or comparative regionalism with Asia. A lot of theories of regionalism in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in fact, until very recently, came from Europe. The lessons of the European Union, before that European Community or European Economic Community. The European model of regional integration was propagated, presented as a universal model in most of the writings on regionalism until very recently. There is no such thing as comparative regionalism. It was a regionalism, European model. The European Union funded massively such projects. European scholars and officials went around saying that this is the model everybody should follow. ASEAN should follow, OAS should follow, or African Union should follow. But you find that European models, now they don't work even in Europe. So it's quite, those days in the 80s and 90s, you can see that the European integration theories, which assumes sort of states cooperate initially on economic issues, then become political cooperation, evolves out of it, and it becomes supranational cooperation. So the purpose of integration is to dilute sovereignty, okay, from economic to political cooperation. In the non-Western world, here in Africa, Asia, it's exactly the other way around. You start with political cooperation first, otherwise you won't have economic cooperation. And secondly, there is no ambition from the beginning or to the end to become a supranational European Union, like a big bureaucracy which can make decisions for you. The purpose of regionalism in the developing world, global South, is exactly the opposite, is to maintain sovereignty. And after losing sovereignty for a few hundred years to the Europeans, they're not going to give up sovereignty to another supranational organization. So there was no supranationality, meaning an overarching organization that takes away, even voluntarily, part of your sovereignty to make decisions on economics and regulation, regulatory mechanisms. So how can a model from European Union actually explain anything relevant in the non-Western world? So that theory basically is a classic example that when you develop a theory from Europe or US, those two examples, and apply to the rest of the world, they don't explain, they don't help you to understand, and they produce outcomes contrary to what the theory has predicted. So global IR, by looking at the regionalism from various parts of the world rather than from Europe, or looking at the application and the functioning of the liberal order, the liberal hegemony in all parts of the world, can actually tell you what is the actually true, what have more explanatory power. Some of the Eurocentric theories may well be right, but a lot of them are not. At least you have a wider canvas to test theories and develop better theories. So therefore, global IR is inclusive, not just of being nice. We all want to be inclusive. It also gives you more intellectual firepower. So inclusive in the academic intellectual sense, as well as in the normative sense. Okay, moving on. There are 6 elements of global IR, and this is well explained in the writing, so I will only look very briefly because I don't want to take too much time on this 6 points. But the first point is pluralistic universalism. So it's the argument that no idea or theory or concept fits all. This is very different from the idea of rationality and universalism we had from European Enlightenment. So the European Enlightenment, from people like Immanuel Kant, for example, basically argued that there is a certain standard of civilization, standard of rationality, and everybody should approximate to that. And if you don't become rational in the sense you still have religious beliefs that goes into your explanation, you don't become civilized. And you deserve to be colonized. Until you do that, you cannot become independent. Even Immanuel Kant, who did not like colonialism, but still said colonialism is going to stay until the non-Western societies. He was very racist, by the way. He had racial classification, considered actually the American Indians as the worst of the worst, the lowest of the low class, if you read Kant's argument, his writings. But he said there is a rational standard of rationality. That's universalism. To be universal is to aspire to one idea dominating over everybody else. That's what IR theories are about, the existing IR theories, that there's realism, liberalism, these are standards. You have to really use them to be able to do international relations as a scholar. So global IR says that's not true, that's wrong. There are multiple ideas, multiple forms of rationality, multiple sense. Every society has a sense of its universalism. Every culture thinks itself as a universal culture. Just like the Chinese think they are universal, Indians think they're universal, Islam thinks they're universal. I'm sure all the pre-Columbian American civilizations also think of themselves as universal before the audience. So you should actually accept it. You should recognize the diversity. But then you still can find some common ground. You negotiate a common space. But first you acknowledge we are different. Then you think how we can be common, rather than saying we are all the same, or it should be the same. And if you're not the same by the European yardstick, then you are not civilized, you don't do international relations. So that's basically first part. World history is very simple. A lot of IR is from European history, but they also bring in a little bit Greco-Roman history. Greece and Rome, which are really not technically European countries. Physically, yes, but civilizationally, Greece was a Mediterranean civilization. Greece was a world unto itself. And so was the Roman Empire. You see the Roman Empire, most of it was in Africa and in East Asia. And it got a lot of ideas. Both Greeks and Romans got a lot of ideas from the East. They are appropriated by Europeans after Renaissance, Enlightenment as European. Whereas Greeks never saw themselves as Europeans. The Greeks saw themselves as Greeks, Hellenists. So for them, Europeans are barbarians, the same way as Asians are barbarians, because they didn't speak the Greek language. And similarly, Romans also saw Northern Europeans as barbarians, themselves as more civilized. And in fact, in some ways, there was actually Roman emperors that are born in Africa. They are maybe even with African mixed descent than from Scandinavia. But to say this is our heritage, and we appropriate Greece and Rome, and then develop IR theory out of it in the European Western context is misleading. But we need to move away from that. We need to look at the history of the whole world, different civilizations, different regions, then build IR theory, rather than the European history, IR theory based on European and US history. Similarly, we don't think of an international system. International relations starts with Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, the so-called birth of the sovereign state system. That's only 400 years old, 1648. But the history of the world, the substance of international relations goes back to 5,000 years, not 400 years. So we should not think that Westphalia explains international relations. The nation state is a permanent reality, sovereign state. Actually, most of the world history is dominated by empires and universal monarchies than by democracies or nation states. So therefore, to understand, a vast majority of countries have lived under a hierarchy than anarchy, including Europeans. So how can you say the last 400 years will basically change everything permanently, and in the same way as the Peace of Westphalia did to Europe, which is also, by the way, problematic, because Westphalia did not really end hierarchy and empire. Many empires remained in Europe after 1648. In fact, some of them were born after 1648. So world history then therefore sort of gives you a wider canvas from which to draw your concepts, rather than from have this false universalism coming out of Europe. The third one is multiple points of origin. This is a kind of slightly repeating what I said, that international relations concepts, and I'll show you a couple of examples of this later, that many ideas, whether balance of power, multilateralism, or cooperation, great power cooperation, which is the origin of multilateralism, norms and ideas like freedom of seas, even humanitarian intervention, or humanitarian assistance, humanitarian protection norms. They have multiple origins, sometimes connected, sometimes unconnected. So you can find certain norms of balancing of power, but mostly empire and hierarchy and protection coming out of, say, places like here, which were not connected in the known way to Asia or Europe before, say, Europeans came in large numbers. So in that sense, you can find that freedom of the seas has independent origins in Indian Ocean and in Mediterranean. Just like certain crops, like cotton. I'm not wearing cotton, but cotton is actually independently grown in Peru for the first time and in India. And we have no evidence of contact between India and Peru. This is going back to thousands of years. India was the largest producer of cotton in the world, and Peru also was, at least in the regional context, his first time cotton was cultivated here. It might have been cultivated in Egypt as well, but we have less evidence of that. So ideas are like that. They grow in different places. Why? It's not rocket science, because human society tries to find similar solutions to similar problems. So if you have a problem of anarchy, you create an order, empire. So a consistent theme in international reader. I am writing a new book on world order. So all civilizations have this theme about chaos versus order. So you have chaos in the beginning, then you create order. And you do that through hierarchy, empire, sometimes through republics, sometimes through empire, sometimes through a decentralized system. So the Mayas, for example, in Mesoamerica had a decentered system. They didn't have an empire. But the Incas have empire, well, at least in empire the way we understand it. Or the Aztecs had an empire. So even within one region, one continent, so to speak, we had different models of finding solutions to the problem of anarchy. But we also had in Greece city-states, which is very similar actually to Maya city-states, and different culturally, but the idea of governing through a decentered model. Sumerians invented the city-state system. Sumer, 5,000 years ago, invented the Sumerian, very interactive, approximately equal, independent state system. And that's followed in both Greece and also India had, before its first empire, system of republics, which are also anarchic. And we had this in Mayas. So why do we then not say the idea of anarchy has multiple points of origin, not just from the Greek city-states, which people talk about the war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, and leading to the defeat. That's kind of the model of anarchy. Then we talk about Westphalia, which also became the model of anarchy. But such things existed in other civilizations. So that's one example. Free trade, humanitarian norms, all came up from the idea of protecting civilians during combat, and not harming warriors who have been wounded or have been dismounted, lost their weapons, actually have multiple origins. It came from ancient India, 300, 400 BC. It came from China, and it was also in Christian Europe, in the Islamic world. And I'm sure it had similar origins in Africa and Latin America, or pre-Columbian America, in some civilizations at least. So again, why don't we consider this as having multiple origins? Why would you, when you talk about the responsibility to protect, R2P, people trace these origins to the Christian ethics, Thomas Aquinas and period after that. This is a Christian ethics, no question about it. But before that, it also had similar origins. In fact, there is a striking resemblance between the Geneva Conventions, which protect civilians in combat, and the Indian Code of Manu, is a lawgiver of the 1st, 2nd century BC. Striking linguistic similarity between who to protect at a time of war. So global IR tries to look at multiple origins of ideas and institutions. Moving on, then the last 3 points will be study of regions. I think global and local are mutually constitutive. So global cannot be seamless. Everything is subsumed, and diversity and difference is forgotten. So regionalism is important. Now, this is also true of how people study international relations. If you look at in a macro perspective, and I think I can only talk about my impressions rather than I haven't done a scientific study of this, but most IR scholars start studying their regions first. So if you see in an American university, like my university, PhD students, what do they write their dissertations about? I think I would say, roughly, ballpark, 70% of them will write about their own region. So students from Turkey will write about Turkey. Students from India will write about India or Southeast Asia. That's how international relations has, always been taught. So as a former U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Thomas O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. All international politics is local. So you cannot just have global forgetting the local. You should use the local, the basis for the global, and also have the global pay respect to the local rather than see them either or. A lot of IR scholars who don't like area studies, and this is like another thing. Area studies, if you study Latin America or Asia, you don't do IR. IR is supposed to be global. There's an aura of respectability and even arrogance about IR vis-a-vis people who do regions. And that's really very harmful because in most parts of the world, international relations rode on the back of area studies. In fact, the current IR, you can say, is American and European area studies. That's all there is. And I say that with a lot of respect for area studies. I am an area specialist of Southeast Asia. So therefore, regions and area studies are very important to IR and should not be disparaged or sidelined. Going to the 5th point is agency. Agency is who does, how one does, produces outcomes in international relations. So an agent is somebody who gets things done, produces an outcome, very broadly speaking. So agency is often seen as material. In hegemonic stability theory, it's all about military power and economic wealth. And a lot of us talk about balance of power, world order, multipolarity, bipolarity, as if it's all produced by economic and military power. But what about ideas? So a lot of countries have agency even if they don't have power. Power is not the same as agency. So you can have many examples of especially agency in the local context, the non-great powers, middle powers, weak powers, like Southeast Asian countries. None of them are great powers, but they have a lot of agency. They have produced one of the most viable forms of regional organization, one of the most successful regional organizations, except for the European Union to some extent. Therefore, agency can be ideas, based on ideas. In fact, weaker actors compensate for the lack of material power by looking at ideas. Ideas like non-alignment with the Cold War basically had a major impact on international relations. But they didn't come from big powers. Those days, China and India were not been big powers. So resistance, so opposing something is also agency. Not accepting something is also agency. That shows that you are not happy with what you are being told or given. And that's exercising agency. Agency can be global and local. So agency, broadening agency, if you broaden agency, you can see that non-Western countries have made, even today, even at the height of liberal hegemony or the British Empire and American hegemony, even at the height of that, these non-Western weaker countries have made tremendous contributions. Some would be like Latin American countries on regionalism, UN Charter, including race and human rights in the UN covenants on human rights. Most of it was done by global South countries, not by Western countries. In fact, it's a very false claim to say that America and Britain champion human rights. They actually opposed human rights because the United States supported Britain, and Britain was very worried that if you have human rights, and human rights can include decolonization, the rights of colonial people, that means Britain will lose its remaining empire. So when the human rights covenants were being negotiated in the 1950s, like political, economic, and social rights, for example, Britain and the United States opposed them, and the developing countries actually supported them because that is their way of championing decolonization. Decolonization is a form of human rights. The UN Charter doesn't mention racism. In fact, only once or twice. It mentions race, but not racism. Colonialism a few times, the UN Charter, because it was drafted mainly by Western countries. But later on, you'll find that every United Nations statement, when UN become bigger with post-colonial nations, mentions race and the need for and colonialism as an abuse of human rights. So that kind of agency is ideational from the weaker actors, and that is very much important to international relations than just intervention, war, and wealth. So that's what Global IR also so opens up a lot of horizons for research that you can study agency. I have a book called Agency and Change in International World Politics, which I'm going to donate to your library, and you'll find that many examples of agency are out there. Then subsuing and displacing existing IR theories and methods. This is a bit controversial. This is something that probably makes those who would be otherwise sympathetic to global IR kind of unhappy. This will include post-colonial theories, or what they call decolonial. I don't make any distinction between post and decolonial. They think global IR is pandering too much to existing theories. Global IR doesn't say you have to stop being what you are doing, a realist, liberal, constructivist, as long as your perspective is truly global. And I think the argument of the post-colonial theories, that some of them from this Latin American region, think, oh, global IR is IR same. No, because I think what it does is that you can do whatever you want. Who am I to tell you what you should do? If you go to China and India, a lot of them do realism. Realism is very popular in China and India. So I'm not going to tell them you are wrong. Indians also do post-colonialism. Chinese do Marxism. So I said, do whatever you want to do, but don't borrow it from only Europe or only from India. You expand your horizons and make it global. Post-colonialism and those who criticize global IR actually don't realize that they also are very narrow, and they only talk about themselves. It's a dialogue of the like-minded. It's like it's a clubbish mentality, and they won't have an argument with the realists and liberals. They would stay within their own group. And this is like, to advance a discipline, you actually have people from different perspectives. You respect diversity. And realism, liberalism, and constructivism are authentic perspectives. They're narrow, they have limitations, but we need to ask them to be broader. We challenge them, shame them to become broader, rather than say, what you are doing is nonsense. We want to reboot and change and extinguish you. That's another form of arrogance. And I find that in some post-colonial theories, that many of them are my good friends, but some of the more extreme ones, I would say that global IR doesn't really create any new knowledge. It's rehashing the same knowledge. That's nonsense. In fact, it's much wider and broader than post-colonial theories because it actually accepts the diversities out there. And as I said, you go to India, you tell the realists that you are nonsense. Everything you're writing is. But a lot of Indian scholars are realists, and imposing on them that you should forget about your realism is another form of discrimination and exclusion. So that's why Global IR strategically took a stance, and I had to think about it very carefully. I knew this would be criticized. I didn't want to give up on the existing theories, but also they cannot be as is, business as usual. So they have to also broaden. You can do realism and do Global IR. You can do liberalism and do Global IR. You can do post-colonialism and do Global IR. And in that is really a very distinctive aspect of Global IR, because most IR theories are turf concepts. So there is a traditional and critical theory. But Global IR is the bridge, is the connects, and it creates a common forum for debate and discussion, rather than saying, in an arrogant way, saying that you are wrong, I am right. So the idea is to enhance knowledge. The idea is to bring in the voices, experiences, histories of all parts of the world, and that requires not dismissing theories and ideas just because they are there before you. All right, so this is basically the 6 points. Moving to the next, how am I doing with the time? 10 minutes? Okay. So we'll move to a couple of examples. I think the bulk of what I wanted to say was in the 6 points. But I wanted to talk about what Global IR does historically. Some examples, and two I'm giving here. There are many, many. So one is empire. As I said, the dominant characteristic of international relations in the last 500 years is hierarchy, is empire and hierarchy, not anarchy. So empire remains a very important concept in international relations. Even to this day, we don't have formal empires, but we have informal empires and hierarchies. So I would say what Global IR tries to do is look at multiple origins, parallel origins, similar ideas, institutions, different but sometimes convergent. So this is kind of a very broad way of saying what Global IR can do in terms of your methodology. So I was thinking of Inca and Persia. This is something that came to me in the last 10 days only. I knew a lot more about Persia than about Inca. But you can find that there are no two civilizations are alike, even within in the Andean region. But you can still have some parallels, some similarities. So you have Inca and Persia, different locations, of course. Time period, Persian Empire is much older, 6th century BC to 3rd century AD, BC. Alexander the Great destroyed it. Then worldviews. The Andean cosmology is much more connected to nature. The Persian worldview is more of a more abstract and linked to actual deities rather than nature. So there are differences, but there is no known contact between Persia and Incas. But we have three broad similarities. Both gave a lot of autonomy to the provinces, not completely, and this is still being debated here in the Inca, how much the Suyus could do on their own. But in Persia's case, very clear that once the area was conquered, the provinces have their own satraps, and they have quite a bit of autonomy. They still have to pay taxes to Persia, but they can decide a lot of the local politics on their own. Local politics, it's like a federal system in many ways, not like the Roman Empire. Then road infrastructure, the Persians built the first major highway, Persian called Royal Road, just like the Incas built the Inca highway that you are very familiar with. And religious tolerance. Neither Persia nor Inca practiced religious persecution. Now, Persia was kind of extreme in religious tolerance. So it never really imposed Zoroastrianism. In fact, they didn't want any converts. In Incas, they, of course, wanted everybody to worship the Inca gods, but they also allowed the local deities to continue. And they can bring in a temple or an image that can be transported from the places they conquered and put it in Cusco so that people can visit them from the provinces, or destroy the temple when the people of the province rebelled. But they generally did not impose their religion, so there's one religion, everything else must be abolished. The way other cultures and civilizations, including the Christians coming to this part of the world did, or some parts of the world, not all parts of the world, the Muslims did. Muslims actually tolerated every other religion. They did destroy some temples, some of the extreme Muslim conquerors, but they actually allowed the Jews to live side by side. And their idea, like Cordoba, was a place for both Muslims and Jews. The moment Fernando and Isabella conquered Cordoba and Granada, they expelled all the Jews. And the Jews actually went to the Ottoman Empire, Islamic Empire. But the Incas never did that. That's unless you were rebellious, you are politically challenging the Inca authority. So there is a similarity. So these are two different empires, but have very similar policies in some respects. That's why the differences. Global IR wants these comparisons and connections. Sometimes compare, sometimes connect. And another example is freedom of the seas. The sea belongs to the whole humankind, not to any particular state or particular empire. Now, you are supposed to have that in the Mediterranean. Under the Roman Empire, piracy was reduced and trade was flowing freely. And when Hugo Grotius, a Dutch scholar, wrote about freedom of seas, he actually referred to ideas from the Roman Empire, from the Mediterranean. But what you didn't mention is that in the Mediterranean, only Roman citizens have right to free trade. If you're not part of a Roman Empire, like somebody else, you don't have the right. The thing is, the Rome had conquered everything in the Mediterranean, so that issue did not become important. But if you had come from, say, Vikings, for example, from Scandinavia, you can have free trade in the Mediterranean. So the two things about freedom of the seas in Mediterranean is that it needed an empire that conquered every state of the littoral. And secondly, only its citizens could have free trade. In the Indian Ocean, there was no empire covering the Indian Ocean, from East Africa to Indonesia and going up to the South China Sea through India, India being in the middle. There was no hegemony, no empire, but it had plenty of free trade. Indian Ocean was the largest trading ocean in the world until the Atlantic trade started after Columbus and the conquest of Latin America or Americas. But Indian Ocean trade was completely free. Anybody can trade if you can pay the duties, customs duties, and you obey the local rules. And the laws are actually codified. Like in Malacca, in Malaysia today, you have codified laws going back to the 14th, 15th century. And the Europeans, when the Portuguese came to the Indian Ocean, they changed it. They occupied Malacca, they introduced a protection system, like a card system. So you pay a certain amount of money and you can trade, otherwise you will destroy you. And that's what the Portuguese developed, kind of a cartage system, a protection racket, basically. But Indian Ocean always had free trade without any empire. There was no Chinese empire, no Indian empire. Another thing about the Indian Ocean Empire is that the reach of the empire ended in land. They never extended to the sea. The Mughal Empire never said, we control the Indian Ocean. So in fact, there was a request to the Mughal Emperor once from island state of Maldives, and the king of Maldives said, we are being harassed by the Portuguese. Can you protect us? He said, our empire stops on land. We do not go to the sea. In Indonesia, the local rulers told the Dutch that, why are you asking us to pay, trade through you? You are a monopoly. They used to trade with each other, the Indonesian island, the Spice Islands. But the Dutch went there, and the same Dutch that Hugo Grotius supported. Hugo Grotius was actually an employee of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch established monopoly, and the Sultan of Makassar, one place in Indonesia, said, we have never heard of sea belonging to anybody. So why should we trade through you? We trade through our own means. We trade with India, we trade with China, we trade with each other. We don't have to go through this monopoly. But of course, the Dutch destroyed them because of superior technology. Basically took over their trade and established a monopoly. But the larger point is that freedom of the seas have multiple origins, at least two here, and they were different, but they were also similar. Both ended up contributing to the law, freedom of the seas, which is the basis of the law of the sea and free trade. Okay, so moving on then to conclude this, what about Latin America and Caribbean? I am of limited knowledge of on this field, but I would like to say that Latin America has been, and Caribbean has been a key source of ideas in IR. I mentioned about regionalism. Regionalism was a really, as a modern political institution, very much originated in this region. And regionalism is a very big part of IR and global IR, but even in the traditional IR. European Union did not invent regionalism. The inter-American system originated much earlier. And dependency theory, which also have reactions to it, like autonomy and peripheral realism, but it's a very much of a Latin American idea that had global implications that apply to Africa, Asia. Post-colonialism, here you actually give a lot of credit to the Caribbean countries, especially scholar activists like Walter Rodney, who was an activist scholar, or even leader like Eric Williams, and many, many, many others. Caribbean is full of very powerful thinkers and activists on post-colonialism, which is a theory of IR. But I think the region now lags behind Asia, Africa, and certainly Islamic world, and certainly Asia, in extrapolating this IR ideas from indigenous history. And that's one of the reasons that I am here, is to actually encourage that. Because compared to China, compared to India, compared to Islam, there is a certain amount of reluctance here to see how the Aztecs, Mayas, Incas, other civilizations, actually the war age preceded the Incas, they build ideas about world order, how to manage interstate relations, not just domestic relations, ideas about war and peace, and diplomacy. And I think that needs to be done. And here there is an opportunity, and I see this as an opportunity, because this is one area where global IR scholars can step in and produce a lot of interesting literature. And as I said, there are plenty of evidence now. Some of the sources are going to be controversial, but you can indulge in that controversy. So the idea of global IR is not just about history, but a historiography. Debates about history also are very good sources of IR and global IR. So that's one thing I would like to urge. Moving on to conclude now, I wanted to stop here. Global IR is actually doing pretty well. You can see that from the Google Ngram, which this is about books, but you can see Google Scholar of books and articles. Since 2014, global IR has kind of taken off and become one of the buzzwords. But finally, we can see the challenges. I think the next will be the last one. There are challenges and obstacles, limitations, and I'm completely aware of them. Lack of resources, research funding, even internet access, either by lack of resources in universities or sometimes by government control of the internet. Libraries are still very important, and a lot of countries don't have good libraries. In the global south, don't have money for books or articles. Language barriers are very, very critical, because English is now the lingua franca of IR, and if you don't do English, like a lot of good scholars in this region, they get sidelined, they get ignored. And Western hegemony and racism in training, hiring, publishing, plenty of evidence. Just look at an IR department, a political science department in the West, you'll find that. There is a bit of a fear. Young, upcoming graduate students think of global IR, how am I going to get a job? Because jobs are defined by traditional theories. So, but now the thing is, we talk about this quite a lot. And if you do a good, solid, methodologically rigorous work, you will get a job. Global IR doesn't invite you to be sloppy, by the way. You can be methodologically rigorous, draw on new sources. In fact, it opens up opportunities. As I said, so little has been written about the pre-Columbian civilizations in IR perspective. That is actually an opportunity. And many journals will be actually very interested if you put together a good argument. As a comparatively, like what I'm trying to do in India or Inca or Persian Inca, or more modernly ideas of regionalism, ideas of sovereignty, approaches to sovereignty. I published an article in International Studies Quarterly looking at different conceptions of sovereignty in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And I published an article in an international organization looking at Southeast Asian historiography, spread of Buddhism and Hinduism from India to Africa, how they were localized in Southeast Asia, could be adapted to apply to norms, how ideas and norms spread in the contemporary economic system. And the other thing is you have a risk of being criticized. This is a very narrow-minded view from, I have seen a lot of that coming from Europe, particularly certain institutions in Europe, that they say that if we do global IR, somehow you are pandering to the government. They actually target the Chinese in particular. The Chinese IR is basically an apology for the government. And most of these people have never been to China, and they don't know what a diverse community China has. Of course, there is a fear of government in China, but that doesn't mean every scholar is doing global IR and supporting India. There was a, I don't want to mention any names, a book on Indian and Brazilian IR. We said all the Indian global IR scholars are basically supporting the Modi government or the Indian government. Actually, that's contrary. A lot of Indian scholars use historical ideas to challenge the government. Mm-hmm. Because you can find in Indian tradition, there is realism and there is liberalism. There is religious tolerance and religious intolerance. So those who challenge, like the Modi government today in India, is intolerant, on the intolerant side. They will draw ideas from ancient India and say, hey, we used to be so tolerant. King Ashoka's idea of regional tolerance. Persian ideas of tolerance are being used throughout the world now as challenging religious intolerance. So global IR is actually, to me, emancipatory, not constraining, not repressive, the way that is being said, accused of. But that's something you have to fight and argue. All right, I am going to stop here and take some questions and go back to sitting over there. There was a couple of other points, but I think we can discuss that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Acharya. Before turning to the Q&A part of this conference, I wanted to share some basic ideas with you, just for 3-4 minutes. But first of all, as the head of the IR undergraduate program, and I think I can speak on behalf of my colleagues, our dear students, it has been a huge honor to have you here at the PUC University. We are, as you can say, very enthusiastic followers and readers of your publications, of your contributions to IR. I mean, I was even thinking about creating a fan club, seeing the amount of students here. We can talk about it afterwards. You're already leaving the country within a couple of hours after almost 1 week here in Peru. And there is good news. We were already planning your next trip to Peru. I think apart from Cusco, from Machu Picchu, there are plenty more